Hello and welcome to Unit 4 of MBA 6113 Change Management. This week we'll discuss uh, organizational culture and particularly the way that culture relates directly to change and change initiatives within the organization. As you can see, the reading for this week is Chapter 4. So we'll cover Chapter 4, in particular a few culture analysis models that are prevalent in perhaps even in some of your other courses, some models that we use to analyze organizational culture and see if the culture that's prevalent within the organization aligns with the strategic initiatives of management. So again, this week we'll focus on culture and how that culture impacts our change initiatives. So last week we talked about the difference between organizational design and organizational structure, and we talked about an organization can be designed one way, but the actual internal structure and the way people do things might be a little bit different. But still, design and structure are still part of what we recognize as the formal organization. The organization is going to operate in a formal way, which are kind of the processes and procedures, the design, the structure, how things actually get done. But the organization also has this informal social environment, this informal kind of network, this informal connection between the leadership and the employees, the personnel, stakeholders. They have this kind of informal relationship between, perhaps they might be friends. Some of the personnel might be friends or even perhaps relatives, or they might be acquaintances, or their kids might go to school together or play soccer together or whatever it is. But there's a informal kind of social network within the organization as well. And so we're going to kind of talk a little bit about the difference between the formal organization and the informal organization, because both of these paradigms, the formal structure, the formal paradigm, and the informal component to the organization, play a key role in whether or not our change initiatives are going to be successful. Just because we set these strategies and goals and we design the organization and we help influence a structure within the organization in which accomplishes certain goals and strategies, doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have buy-in for all of our change initiatives and the things that we want to accomplish within the organization. That might need to come from some of the informal components as well. So when we think of the formal organization, we obviously talk about strategies and goals for the company. We obviously set strategies in place, or we develop strategies to kind of get us from here to there, figure out where we want to be in the future. How do we develop strategies to become more competitive, to grow, to diversify? So we build these strategies, and we obviously set goals, figure out where we want to go, how we're going to get there. How do we track our progress to determine whether or not we are achieving our goals? We develop processes and procedures to help us accomplish those strategies and achieve those goals. We develop an organizational design that should be the most effective and efficient way of operating within that organization. We also help manage the organizational structure, which again is the way that things actually get done. So the structure being the way that things actually get done, we help kind of manage that in a way that we kind of monitor the way things are accomplished within the organization. We make sure that that aligns with the design and vice versa. The formal organization, we have very specific products or services that we offer. This kind of becomes our portfolio of products and services that we basically sell, whatever our organization is in the business of doing. That becomes obviously is part of the formal organization. And then obviously the management structure. We perhaps have a very formal, probably have a very formal management component within the organization. But all of these things can be in place, and they can even be operating effectively, efficiently. They can be doing their job. They can be doing what they're supposed to be doing. There's still always going to be this informal component to the organization. The way that we actually feel about the organization, the way that we think of morale. You've probably heard of kind of the grapevine, within an organization. The way people talk, what they think, what they value, what are the beliefs. There's kind of that old saying, especially in kind of leadership, perhaps in a leadership course, you talk about how do we gauge the cohesiveness, the synergy of a department. How do we, as managers, as leaders, how do we try to understand how our department or our organization feels about one another, about the organization as a whole? And we kind of, I don't want to say jokingly, because there is some a little bit of truth to this, but we kind of jokingly say that you can somewhat gauge the level of morale or cohesiveness of a project team or a department or even an organization in how they reference themselves and the organization. If you walk down the hall and you perhaps ask somebody on a project team, how's this project coming, or what's the latest update on the project? How's it going? And if that particular individual says, well, they're doing this, they're doing that, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, they're marketing the project, they're growing it. If employees or individuals at kind of the middle, frontline worker to middle level employee position, when you ask them, what do you think about the direction of the company? Where are we going? How's the project going? What do you think about these new products or services? And that individual were to say something like, well, they're doing this, they're doing that, referring to management or referring to the project team or whatever. They. Then perhaps they feel disconnected. Perhaps there's not that cohesive or synergy within the organization that we want there to be. Versus if you walk down the hall and you ask an employee the same questions, how do you feel about the direction of the company? How do you feel about these new products or services? What do you think is about this new direction, this vision that we're for the company? Well, we this, we that, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing some great things, we're growing, we're changing this. And so it's kind of the old saying, is the company or is the project team or is the department, is it a they company? Is it a they department? Is it a they organization? Or is it a we organization? Is it a we department? Is it a we project team? And as managers and as leaders, we can get up there all day long and say, well, we're a team, we're a team, we're a team. It's a we organization, we team, we project team, we department, all this stuff. But if the individuals kind of at the front lines, if the folks in in the trenches, doing the work, that kind of thing, don't reflect that same mentality. You know, our team, we're doing this, we're doing that as an organization. If instead they say, they're going they, well, the informal organization might not align with what we've set forth within the formal organization. And so that's kind of the old, kind of the old saying, is it a we company versus a they company? And that kind of very simple test, I guess, is a good way of trying to gauge the synergy and cohesiveness and morale and collaboration within the organization, because it's a great way to try to help understand what's taking place within the informal organization, because we can learn so much valuable information, especially when it comes to implementing change. When it comes to implementing change, we can learn so much valuable information from the informal organization. What are the values, attitudes, and beliefs of the company? What are the values, attitudes, and beliefs of the department, of the project team? Not just what's posted in the mission statement. Not what's just posted in the vision statement. Not in the press releases that the company issues every quarter. What are the informal, within the informal organization, what are the values, attitudes, and beliefs within the company? And this obviously, leadership styles of different levels, executive levels within the organization, obviously the culture within the organization, and then the power in politics. Every organization has, there's going to constantly be kind of internal politics, power struggles, that kind of thing. All of these items they all make up what we call the informal component to the organization. And it is, I don't want to say it's equally important as the formal organization, because they're two entirely different things, but it is vital to understanding. We've got to be able to understand the informal component of the organization if we are to be successful at implementing change, simply because change initiatives are going to be, the acceptance of change initiatives are going to be influenced by these components to an extent that the formal organization can't reach. We can come in and we can get approval from stakeholders, or perhaps the CEO if we're a department head, or whatever it's going to be, but we can help craft strategies. We can set goals. We can develop processes and procedures. We can design and influence the structure of the organization to help accomplish these goals. We can have great products or service offerings. We can put the right management in place. But if there's not the support of the informal organization, you'll have this internal sabotage. And you've probably experienced this yourself, perhaps within your own organization, or you're aware of a situation when an organization perhaps had a great idea, had a great strategy, had a great product, but perhaps it changed something. Perhaps it made some people uncomfortable, or perhaps there were some power and politics in place that didn't allow it to manifest itself in the way it should. So there was terrible execution. The culture, the things that should take place aren't taking place. A great example of this, and I'm not one to obviously bring politics into the discussion, but a great example of this is our own government right here in the United States. We look at Congress, we look at the House and the Senate. We look at these organizations that have a very formal organizational structure in terms of how they're supposed to work. The structure, the makeup of our governing bodies, between the three branches of government and the balance of power and the theoretical design and structure of how these different branches are supposed to work. And so we can design a system, we can design a a system to operate with processes and procedures and goals and all of these things to operate in a way that makes perfect sense. But perhaps the values, the attitudes, beliefs, the power, the politics, all of the other informal components that go into that can just cause total chaos. A great example in the news right now is the conflict and the back and forth with this healthcare initiative, the Affordable Care Act. You have groups on both sides of the aisle, the political spectrum, and then obviously with the implementation of the national healthcare exchanges and the problems, the technology problems that they're having, and the implementation problems that they're having. And when you're trying to implement change, which is exactly what is taking place, there is a new initiative. The Affordable Care Act is a new initiative. It is a game-changing initiative for that particular sector. For good or for bad doesn't really matter at this point, because we don't know what's going to happen, and that's a different debate for a different class. But nonetheless, this Affordable Care Act is a change initiative. There's no question about it. It is something that is different, something that's never been done. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. We can put structures and processes and procedures and have goals and strategies in place to try to execute. However, the initial launch of this change initiative has been pretty much an epic nightmare at this point. And a lot of the challenges that are having, they are very similar to what we see with, very typical, very common, what we see with new big change initiatives. So it's not necessarily true that because this change initiative is bad, it's been a colossal failure. It's not necessarily true that because this change initiative is good, it should have been an epic success. Neither one of those is necessarily true. All we know is that you're trying to change a system, you're trying to change a industry, a system, a process that has been in place for a long time. You have a lot of different groups that have different values, attitudes, and beliefs about this change. Some of them think it's great, some of them think it's terrible. Some folks think it's the best thing, it's been needed to be done for a long time. Some folks think it's the end of the world, But nonetheless, you have a colossal change initiative. You have this huge change initiative that you're trying to implement on this national level. Well, you can kind of see a lot of the processes, the things that we've talked about and will continue to talk about in this class, barriers to change, problems with implementing change, the informal attitudes, beliefs, power, politics, culture that can either make a change initiative successful or can cause it to fail. All of those things can be seen and kind of manifested in this implementation of this Affordable Care Act, because it is a huge change initiative. And again, whether you support it or don't support it, or that doesn't matter. Whether I support it or don't support it doesn't matter. And that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is if you were in a position and you were the person responsible for trying to make this thing happen. You got hired to be the person responsible for rolling out this healthcare exchange and helping implement this these healthcare exchanges for the Affordable Care Act. You're basically being asked to roll out a change initiative, something that is completely new and different. And so you could expect these same types of challenges. So if you don't prepare for them, if you don't kind of go through the steps, some of the things we've been talking about here, then you're going to have some challenges. All right. A couple of things before we get into some of the models. A couple of things about some characteristics of culture. Because when we talk about change initiatives, again, the informal organization, culture is a component of that, but it's kind of one of the leading factors influencing the success or failure of a change initiative. So when we start talking about the culture within an organization, we want to know, is that culture, what is that culture's perspective on innovation? Is the culture within the organization, is it risk-taking or is it risk-averse? If this change initiative is innovative and new and kind of dynamic and something that hasn't been done before, is the culture going to reject it because it's too risky, or are they going to be more accepting of that level of risk? We also want to know, with regard to the culture, what's the level of detail associated with different tasks in that culture? This helps us understand perhaps the level of specialization, perhaps the level of the skill sets, the level of education. How detailed are the different tasks that are being performed within that culture? These three right here, outcome focused, people focused, or team focused, we'll talk a little bit more here with these models, but we want to know, is the culture of this organization focused on results? Is it focused on people? Are we focused on results? Accomplish our goals at any cost? Are we focused on people? We have to take care of the people first, or are they focused on team successes? Does the culture exhibit high levels of internal aggression? Is there a lot of competitiveness, a lot of internal power struggles, territorial fights and battles within the organization? How stable is the organization? So all of these things, we've got to understand the cultural dynamic. If we're trying to implement some type of change, we've got to understand, what's the culture? What's the cultural dynamic? What are the characteristics of the culture that we're talking about? Now, if you've taken the innovation course in the MBA program here at USW, you've already seen this probably. And I think there was 1 week spent on in the innovation course that talked about the competing values framework. You can see that there's, throughout this class and throughout the innovation course, there is some overlap. There are some pretty significant areas where innovation and change overlap. There is kind of this kind of go-between, this crossover between strategy, innovation, change, sustainability, kind of long-term sustainable solutions to business problems. Those areas have a tendency to overlap when we talk about strategy, particularly innovation and change. Those two things go hand in hand, and we've talked about it in this class already, that anytime you try to be innovative, if you as an organization or your company, if you're trying to implement some type of new product or service that is innovative and new and different, that is going to change something. It's either going to change the way you do business, it's going to change the way, if it's an innovative process within your company, you're doing things in a new and unique and dynamic way, and it's an innovative process, it's going to change something. If it's a new product, it's going to change something. If it's a new service, it's going to change something. So innovation and change almost go hand in hand. You really can't have innovation without change, and anytime you have change, there's probably some innovation somewhere that is causing it. So otherwise, you just have change for the sake of change. If you're trying to change something just to change it, you're going to run into all kinds of problems, because you're going to have that argument, well, this is change for the sake of change. Just because we feel like changing something, we're just going to do it. Typically, you see that change is usually innovation driven. So you've seen this particular model, I'm sure. If you've taken the innovation course, you've seen this model. If you have not taken the innovation course yet, and you're going to, then you will see this model again. The competing values framework is probably one of the best and most commonly used models, visuals for understanding organizational culture, and how the focus of the organization impacts our ability to implement change and innovation. And the competing values framework kind of starts here with this kind of 4-point grid. You have these, this horizontal arrow going two directions, and this vertical arrow going 2 directions. We say, within the competing values framework, we basically recognize that every organization kind of operates in terms of their values, in terms of their focus, in terms of their culture, operates in kind of 2 dimensions, on 2 different planes. The plane in which it focuses either internally, primarily on its internal operations, its internal resources, its people, human resources, processes internally, or the external, the organization itself, the external environment. And we can pick out different organizations, and you can say, okay, the culture within that organization, or the focus within that organization, primarily is upon internal policies and procedures and people, and we focus a lot on the people, and we emphasize autonomy, and we want our people to be happy and creative and all this different stuff. Or we focus externally on the company itself, the company as a whole. We want the organization to succeed as a whole. We got these goals, and we're gonna replace individuals that don't perform, that kind of thing. So every organization will kind of align itself somewhere along this plane here, either as having more of an internal focus or having a slightly more of an external focus. An organization might be still have some focus on the people, but more of a focus on the organization. It might be perfectly balanced right here in the middle. That's one dimension. The other dimension here is the level of flexibility versus the level of control within the organization. How flexible and quick the organization is, and how able it is to quickly adapt to the new market conditions, the new environment, or how controlling, what level of control does the organization have. And a great example of an organization that has an external focus on the organization as a whole and has a significant level of control is the United States military. The United States military, even if you look at the different branches of the military, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, if you look at the different branches of the military, you can even look at each one of those as an organization. But the U.S. military as a whole is an organization just like any other. Yet the military itself has an external focus, mission first type of thing. We've got to accomplish the goal and the mission. And we have a high level of control. We have very stringent policies and procedures. not just anybody can make, decisions at any point. You don't deviate from your orders. You follow your orders. So a very significant level of control. And they have to operate out here in this quadrant. It has to be done that way. And so the rational goal model, which is a decision-making model that is often used in the military, if you've ever heard of game theory, game theory is very common in military strategy. And game theory is a kind of a branch of the rational choice theory, rational choice model. But nonetheless, the military operates kind of in this quadrant right here. You might have another organization with an external focus that requires a significant level of flexibility. Company like a great example, company like Google or Facebook. Organizations that focus on the company as a whole, yet require innovation, adaptation, the open systems model. And you've ever heard of open source software, and that kind of aligns with the open systems model. A lot of collaborative efforts, a lot of innovation. You've got to be very flexible. And so, a lot of technology companies kind of operate in this quadrant. We focus on the organization as a whole, yet we've got to be innovative. And so we kind of have this open systems model. Over here on this side, we might have more of a focus on personnel, on the individuals themselves, yet still offer some level of flexibility. Companies like Atlassian, which is a Australian company, you might even be able to make the case that Mozilla, if any of you are watching this in Firefox, the browser Firefox is developed. The parent company, the Firefox products is Mozilla, and Mozilla is an interesting organization in terms of their organizational design and structure. They're a nonprofit, sort of. It's kind of a different blend of organizational structure. I mean, it's a organization that is kind of built up of, particularly with the development of Firefox. Firefox, interestingly enough, is changes and developments to the Firefox browser and some of the Mozilla products are actually done by developers and engineers and software designers and software engineers all around the world for free. They kind of volunteer their time to do this, and they make inputs and changes to it because there's kind of a level of commitment and participation, openness to developing this product in a way that benefits everyone, and they enjoy doing it, and so they kind of volunteer their free time to do this. And so more of a human relations model can be argued that perhaps Mozilla might use. And then if you have an organization that has an internal focus with a significant level of control, might use this internal process model when we're kind of analyzing their culture. And again, a lot of this comes from Chapter 4, but there's so much more to the competing values framework, especially when we're trying to understand culture and figure out how that culture aligns with our strategy. You'll see out here on the outer rim here kind of an organizational direction for organizations kind of operating in each one of these quadrants. If you're an organization where you have a significant external focus, require flexibility, and you kind of adopt these models for operating, you're obviously hoping to move towards expansion and change. So this model is probably one of the most influential in helping understand the effects and the impacts of strategy and culture and change and innovation and organizational alignment, what our focuses are within the organization, and are we aligned and are we moving in the right direction. So you might see this multiple times, but when you're working on the assignments this week and when you're thinking about your own organization, think about where your company or perhaps the company that you want to work for kind of falls on this within this model. Is a significant amount of control required within your industry? Does your organization have a significant external focus? Then you probably should be operating within this quadrant. So you think to yourself, are these the actual goals and objectives and operating parameters within your company? If your industry or your organization pretty much requires or needs a significant amount of flexibility to execute the strategies that you've laid out for the company, do you have to be flexible? Because there's a lot of change, there's a lot of new things happening, a lot of technology, a lot of competitive things taking place within your industry that require you to be flexible so you can be innovative. And you need that external focus, so you should be operating within these parameters, focused on innovation, adaptation, resource acquisition, and growth, implementing this open systems model for decision making, so that way you can expand towards change. You should be operating here, but in fact, you have an internal focus, you've got significant levels of control, you're primarily focused on process documentation, a lot of information management, and you're operating over here, then you know that, wait a second, we're just maintaining the status quo, continuity. We're just consolidating when we should be operating over here. So this model helps us align culture, because where we fall on these two different planes as an organization, if we look at our culture and think, you know what, we have an internal focus primarily on, our human resources, our human capital, maintaining the system. We should have an external focus. You know what? We have a lot of control. We should have flexibility. It helps us understand that if we're going to move out this way, yet we're operating over here, we've got to implement some changes. So those four models, those four quadrants, the human relations model emphasizes flexibility with an internal focus. The organization itself will try to be effective through the development of human resources. Internal process model, very controlling with an internal focus. The open systems model, as I mentioned a moment ago, seeks flexibility and an external focus because we're trying to grow, acquire new resources, that kind of thing. And then finally, the rational choice model, or rational goal model, controlling with an external focus. And those, each one of these operational models or decision-making models for executives fit within each one of these here quadrants. So it's just a way to help us understand, how does our culture align with our strategy? If we're out of alignment, how do we kind of bring that back into alignment? The last thing that here that fits with, we just mentioned the rational choice model in the image before, kind of showed us how to analyze our culture, how our culture aligns with our strategies. This graphic actually shows us if we are out of alignment, or if something needs to be done, if we're in a leadership role and we're operating out here, we've got a lot of flexibility, we need flexibility within our organization with an external focus, and we're operating out here in this open systems model. The leadership roles that we should be taking are perhaps that of an innovator, learning to live with change, think creatively, create change within our organization. Or we should be playing the role of a broker, maintaining a power base, negotiating agreement and commitment, presenting ideas, trying to constantly implement change out here in this quadrant. If we're not playing the role of an innovator or broker, then we're not aligned with this strategic model out here. Same is true over in this area. If we've decided that our strategies pretty much require us to have an internal focus, a significant level of flexibility, and perhaps we do. Perhaps we've achieved that. Yes, we do have an internal focus and we do have a significant level of flexibility. And so our role as a leader is to focus on this human relations model. We should be playing the role of a mentor or a facilitator. We should be communicating effectively, developing subordinates. We should be building teams, managing conflict. We should be moving out this direction. So the previous graphic and illustration helped show how to analyze where our organization is within that competing values framework. How does that culture align with that and align with our strategies? This graphic shows us, are we doing our job as executives and managers, as leaders? Are we fulfilling the appropriate role for that strategic model? If we should be operating in this quadrant up here, the open systems model, we're trying to develop change and move out here, yet we're playing the role of a monitor, then we've got something wrong. We're out of alignment. And perhaps you've seen something like this before. You have an organization that, and the opposite is true. If you have an organization that's focusing internally with a significant level of control, these things should be taking place. We should just simply be monitoring performance, managing documentation. Yet you bring somebody in who wants to change everything, you have a significant problem. And the opposite is true. If you've got a division of the organization that is trying to be influential change and creating change, and you bring somebody in who all they do is micromanage existing performance, then we've got challenges. Final thing here, when we're dealing with culture, when we're trying to implement change, there's only 4 things that can happen. The reason that culture is so important to successful implementation of change is because there are only 4 things that we can do. We have to deal with culture. We have to address culture when we're trying to implement change. So, obviously, we can do this right here, which is obviously not something we want to do. We can change our strategy to fit the organizational culture, which is obviously not a good idea. We've established our strategies already. We've developed a vision for the organization. We've prepared strategies based on a competitive analysis of the internal and external environments. We know what we have to do to succeed, to be competitive in the future. We know where we want our organization to go, what we want it to accomplish. So we already have strategies that we're trying to implement, that we're trying to execute. It's not a good idea to change the strategy to fit the culture, because then you have you have this perpetuating the status quo. We're just continuing to maintain what already exists. That's not innovation. That's not change. So that only leaves these 3 possible techniques, ways to deal with culture. Obviously, we can ignore the culture completely. We can focus on the formal organization and put processes in place, completely ignore the culture, and move forward. Obviously, this is going to be risky. It's incredibly risky when we're talking about an organization with limited or low resources, because when you ignore the culture, it takes longer for that change initiative to become a reality. The culture will kind of dig its heels in and not try to change. And it takes a long time for people to become accustomed to this new way of doing things, and they slowly come around and get on board. So if you're dealing with limited or low resources, you can't really afford to ignore the culture. So that leaves, if you're an organization with unlimited resources and you're not in any hurry, great. You can change something small and then make change in increments, and then slowly the organization will catch up. Otherwise, we're left with two different options here. We can manage around the culture, or we can change the culture altogether. Often we find that we end up managing around the culture. When there's more than one way of achieving desired goals, we often find ways to make the culture of an organization comfortable with this change initiative and make a few changes and tweaks to the implementation so that the culture kind of embraces it, and we still accomplish the same goal, yet we've done it in a way that makes the culture more accepting of it. This is probably the most common. It is possible to change the culture, and over time the culture is probably going to change anyway. Even if we're managing around the culture, more than likely the culture is going to change anyway as these initiatives take hold. But changing the culture is obviously going to be difficult and lengthy, but we're more likely to achieve a long-term alignment with our strategic goals. If we decide to try to manage around the culture, we should, in the back of our minds, be thinking, over time, we're actually trying to change this culture. Even though we're trying to get this change initiative implemented, we want these changes to slowly change the culture itself. That's kind of the long-term goal there. So that pretty much wraps up the lecture for Unit 4. Next week we'll move forward with obviously Unit 5 and keep going through the book. Again, it's important to understand that competing values framework because it is so vital to both innovation and change, and really helps kind of put together that analysis of an organization when trying to be innovative, when trying to align culture and strategy and projects. It's very helpful in doing that. So make sure that you're comfortable with that competing values framework.